to leave the European Union. Inshallah, we'll be back to discuss this after a short break. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to Hudda Tonight. Our social segment this evening is a political item looking at Brexit, the vote national referendum recently held in Britain to pull out of the European Union. Before we introduce our guests, we'd like to read an introduction he prepared for us. It says that over the last few years, the probability that Britain may leave the European Union has grown. In December 2011, the Prime Minister David Cameron refused to sign the EU's Fiscal Stability Treaty after other member states rejected his demands for safeguards for the City of London. In October 2012, his government announced that Britain intended to opt out of many areas of European justice and home affairs cooperation. And in January 2013, Cameron offered the British public a referendum on the European Union membership in 2017. If the Conservatives win in 2015 general election. Okay, so this is provides somewhat of a context for us, setting up the conversation that we want to have with our guests. Professor emaad.muhanna, assalamu alaikum, welcome to.
Welcome, and thanks for having me. Thank you.
All right, it's our pleasure to have you. We'd like to, before we start opening the subject, we'd like to begin looking at a short report on this subject and then come back to continue our conversation.
The European Union, commonly known as the EU, was formally formed to unite Europe under the umbrella of economic and political partnership, strongly binding 28 European countries. The creation of the European Union was initiated after the Second World War in order to raise the European economy from the debris after the war. This economic and political community was important to strengthen ties and save the European continent from sliding back into war. Britain formally joined the EU on the 1st of January 1973, after the French President General de Gaulle's veto on British membership to join the Union. Since Britain became member of the European Union, it has been playing leading roles side by side with her economic giant neighbors, France and Germany, in both affairs affecting the EU within Europe and abroad. However, due to some complex issues pressing the continent regarding economy, security, immigration and common interests, some British politicians began campaigning for Britain to leave the EU, entitling the move as Brexit. Due to consistently growing pressure on the British government headed by former Prime Minister David Cameron, a referendum was slated to allow the British to express their democratic right on whether to remain in the EU or exit. On Thursday, 23 June, the British people voted to leave the European Union to decide whether the UK should leave or remain in the European Union, with 52% to leave against 48% to remain. The Leave of the EU campaign, which was opposed by Mr. David Cameron, forced him to resign after the majority of the British voted to leave. The former Prime Minister has been replaced by Theresa May, who will now lead Britain during this historic moment of the United Kingdom.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome back. We'd like now to open our discussion with Professor emaad.muhanna. Professor, I'd like to start by asking you to describe for us, to characterize the type of union that the European Union is, and please compare it to globalization.
Well, the economic integration basically takes 5 different levels, starting from level 1 of a free zone, and in that particular type, let's say 2 or 3 countries remove the trade barriers among them and allow the free flow of goods and services. So level 1 is removing the trade barriers. Level 2, the 2 countries or the 3 countries basically start implementing the same internal policy in terms of how they take the tariffs rate, in terms of how they take the exchange rate, in terms of how they set up the value of the taxes or the interest rates. The third level, basically, the group of countries will adopt the same external policy. So if, for example, 2 countries have the third level, one of them is cutting relationship with country X, the other one will have to cut the relationship as well. So free trade, and then internal economic policy, and then external economic policy. The fourth one is economic integration, and that's where the European Union is. Okay. The fourth level includes the previous or the prior 3 levels as well, in terms of free trade barriers, in terms of adopting the internal policy, adopting external policy, and the fourth level, you start having a central reserve bank, you start having the same parliament, the same policy, the same labor laws, things like that. The fifth level is the political integration. And this is where you find, for example, the entire group of European countries get under one president. So that's the fifth level, and no group of countries have really reached that. This is totally different to the confederation or the federation. So we can't compare what is happening in the European Union to what's happening in the United States, for example. So we can't regard the states of the United States, the 50 states, are countries, and then getting into a political integration on a fifth level. It's totally different. It's one country, but just divided differently. In terms of the globalization, very much is an approach where economic integration takes place on different levels. It doesn't get classified, but it has different rules of how you join the group of countries signing into the WTO. In the 80s, it's used to call GATS, the General Agreement of Trade and Tariffs, and then followed by services. But now, after the launch of 1995, the WTO, the World Trade Organization, it became basically the umbrella of all global economic integration. What it basically enforces that countries that join the agreement or the declaration of the WTO will have to remove the trade barriers, and basically they might have some reserves. For example, if Egypt wants to have reserves on importing cotton, for example, because they have cotton, they can do that. If Saudi Arabia wants to have embargo on importing oil, for example, they can do that. So the WTO is an agreement. It's not a setup like the 5 different levels where the European Union basically is.
Got it. Thank you very much for that distinction. Could you describe for us, how would you characterize trade in the European Union, and what is Britain's role or has it been in this trade?
Within the European Union, basically, if we're looking at how the Union basically started from the 70s, and basically the role, as we heard in the report, the role of the late Charles de Gaulle, trying to unite Europe, particularly try to create an economic forum that basically competes with the United States. It takes basically different level. The first level, we call it a single market, and that's particular single market. We can have a lot of differences where countries open up to each other in terms of trade, in terms of movements of capital or labor, and then it goes up to free movements. So it's a level up within the European Union in terms of having the production move from one country to another, which basically call the movements of labor and capital. We find that it moves up to the contribution of the overall European budget. So that's a third level up within the European Union. Start to find the European countries signing into the European Union agreement basically contribute into the budget of the European Union, and then start seeing after that that they start to consolidate some similar laws which they didn't have in the beginning. And then in 1995 they reached the ultimate of how it's formed with the introduction of the euro. So the euro was really the top up of how the European Union basically works. In terms of England, England really played a major role, particularly because of the City of London, as we heard in the introduction, and it's also in the report. The British, despite the fact that they voted to opt out, the fact that they worried about London itself, because London is one of the major economic hubs in the world. So if they exit the European Union, how is that going to impact on London? Are the stock exchange will be affected? Are the headquarters of major large multinational corporations move out of London? So they worried about that, and that's why you find the difference in voting in or out is actually very minor. You find about 52% saying to opt out. But if you look at the actual breakdown of who voted to opt out, are not the major places. London, for example, 40% to leave, 60% didn't want to leave. So Scotland, 38% to stay, and the rest, 62% to stay in.
Opposite.
In Ireland, North Ireland, 44% to leave, and then 46% to stay. So you find here that the major hubs in Britain are saying, no, we don't want to leave. But the other places where, like southwest, northwest, the east of London, northeast of London, Midland, those are, you know, it's probably countryside on some areas or some other smaller cities. But the major cities are saying, no, we don't want to opt out of European Union. So because of the political and economic levels of England, they played a major role. So despite the fact they didn't accept, as we heard in the introduction, didn't accept the referendum or the proposal of David Cameron, they still played a major role on how the economic movements in Europe was taking place, along their neighbors, with particularly Germany. In terms of how they benefited from that, we looked at some of the areas they contributed in the European Union, about 8.5 billion English pounds. They benefited about 3 million workers associated to the European Union. They benefited in terms of the foreign direct investment. So England, and particularly London, is regarded basically the first country that attracts the foreign direct investment, not just from the European Union, but also from non-European countries. So these are all areas where a lot of British people are worried, how is that going to be affected by the exit of the European Union.
Now, in terms of the movement that brought this about, was the concern that the poor performance in such countries as Italy and Greece would negatively affect Britain? Is that the reason?
Yes,
or?
they drag it down. This is one of the opinions. The economic opinions say that the slow performance of particularly southern European countries, Italy, Spain, Portugal, and France in certain areas, are really affecting the finances of England, because they became very much, liable for any damage, economic damage that might take place. And we've seen the Greek scenario, we've seen the Spanish and the Portuguese scenario. But also part of the exit is political. I do believe that the ties between England and the United States is one of the reasons that are affecting the performance of the European Union, because the European Union is the major economic competitor with the United States. So the United States always have that nail in a coffin, if you like, and I think England was the nail of the coffin, European coffin. And we had a previous episode a while ago, we talked about regional economic integration, where we talked about the Arab Union, if you want to implement the Arab Union, and we said that because of the
or the
richness of resources.
The need for Arab Union, right?
Exactly.
Right now to Arab
exactly,
League,
because of resources that are allocated in the Arab Union, we can easily exceed the performance of the European Union. So we will see in the next 2 to 3 decades, we'll see major competition in economic integration. And here we go back to the first question, is if countries have the WTO, the World Trade Organization agreement overall to open trade barriers and allow countries to trade with each other, why are countries having regional trade blocks or smaller trade blocks? Because of the globalization, or the open global trade block, is not actually a block, it's an wide open trade barriers. It increases the number of poverty, or the poverty percentage in the world, because the rich countries rely on poor countries for material. Materials are sent from poor countries like Africa, for example, send it over to first world countries or developed countries, manufacture them, and then they receive them again for high prices. And then basically it creates some sort of reliance In terms of materials, the north on the south, and in terms of production, the south on the north. So we don't produce anything in Africa, we just get everything from Europe. So we get it for high prices. So that's one of the problem of globalization. Regional trade blocks also helps countries to get rid of the trade deficit. For example, if we look at poor countries, they have major trade deficit with large countries. For example, if we look at country A might trade with United States. So they're sending United States goods and services for about $1 billion. But they receive goods and services from United States manufacturing everything for about $15 billion. That $14 billion difference in trade comes out of the balance of payments. So it affects the country negatively, and it affects the dollar rate of exchange, and this is what is happening in countries like Egypt. Why? Because the trade deficit in Egypt is quite high. Whatever Egypt sends out in terms of export, they get double that or 4 times that in terms of import. So regional trade blocks countries are very close to each other in terms of the economic standards. So if we look at the SADC, the South African Development Community in Southern Africa, South Africa, Namibia, Zambia, Botswana, and Swaziland, very close in terms of the level of the currency, in terms of the standard of living, so they can trade easily with each other. If we can do this in an Arab country, most of the currencies in the Arab country are close. Difference is about 10% or 15% is not measured, except Kuwait. But the difference here, you're talking about England, for example, the difference with the European Union is huge, particularly Eastern Europe. So regional trade blocks is a replacement to the globalization because countries in the bloc can have easy terms of trade rather than being exploited by major developed countries.
Could you please update us on the status of this movement? They conducted the referendum. We got the results you were just talking about. Where does it stand now?
It will take a while. I think it takes about 2 years for England to opt totally out, because there's a lot of organizations that are dependent on the situation, so they just don't get out. The status at this moment, it's creating a lot of doubt in Europe. Firstly, look at Germany and France. In the last episode of the Greek financial crisis, I think Germany played a major role in that, and it becomes really a burden on Germany. So my expectation is that Germany will start thinking about it.
In terms of bailouts?
In terms of bailout. Greece is not getting any better. Spain is having problems. Eastern Europe is having a lot of problems. The political also situation in Europe in terms of the Russian conflict with the Europeans, it's causing a lot of crisis in there, and a lot of countries are starting to doubt how it's going to work. And my expectation is going to collapse. And
the European Union itself.
The European Union will collapse, or will go down to the basic level of a free zone. As we have it here in the Arab world.
Meaning that the economic integration will become less?
The integration will become less, so you will rely mainly on issues like, open up the trade barriers, allow some of the movements of capital or labor.
Downgrading to like level 1?
Level 1 of the single market, just a market, and we helping each other. So as we do agreements here between Egypt and Saudi Arabia, or Saudi Arabia and Emirates, it's just a very, very simple form. And the reason for that is, number one, Europe is an aging society. A lot of them, or most population, is over 40. So the production is getting less in Europe. We've seen, because of the cost of production in terms of finances, a lot of factories are moving out of Europe. Because of the high cost of living, the high cost of labor in Europe, a lot of factories are moving out to China. So China, with attracting a lot of investment in Europe, in terms of factories, in terms of labor, in terms of finances, Europe will find itself as just a place for holiday. So my expectation is going to slowly dismantle. That's number one. Number two, the rise of other tigers, if the Arabs pick up the opportunity. I regard the Arab community, the 24 countries, as the next economic tiger in the world, because they control over 40% of natural resources. It's a young nation. opposite of Europe. Europe is an aging society. The Arabs, about 65% are below 25. So it's a very young society. Technology is getting slowly getting in. They're learning, but it needs an economic and a political will where all the countries integrate. But here you find a lot of other problems, whether a country like Kuwait, for example, will accept integration because their dinar is about 26 pounds. Or 28 Egyptian pounds, so it's going to be different.
Yeah.
The difference between Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Emirates, very, very minor, but some other countries like Kuwait will have an impact. So the rise of the Arabs, the rise of South America with the leadership of Brazil, the rise of the East, this is really the major one, India, China, Korea, and some of the other islands like Singapore and Malaysia. So this is where you find Europe is really having less advantage to compete on a global level. In terms of the political context, I think the issue of the competition with the United States is not going to allow them to progress.
I have to ask you this question. It's a pressing question that I hear a lot about when making this comparison between the Far East, these countries, and the way that they were able to bring themselves up, South Korea and others. Why doesn't that happen on the African continent? What prevents, what allows it to happen in the Far East, but not?
Colonization. One of the major damages that colonization causes is the cultural damage. Cultural damage that creates a lot of corruption. So Africa is full of corruption. So find, for example, when a colonial power gets in, they pay me to be against you. So that's how it works. And that's what you find. People are killing each other for diamond in Central Africa. And they're both poor. So what are you killing me for and what am I killing you for? People in other countries are killing each other because of ethnic differences. People are killing each other because of the political differences, like the tribal war. So if you actually look at the situation, people are not thinking. They're not. And even in the Arab world, you find a lot of groups are fighting with each other, and they both in a worse situations ever. So they just think. And the same thing you find, what is Sunnis and Shias are fighting each other for? What are you fighting for? You've got economic crisis on your hand. Your differences is political or religious, fine. Worship whoever you want. But in the end, we're both poor. But they don't think. So going back to Africa, I think corruption. Number two is the political involvement or interference always from the colonial countries, because I can never control the resources of a country unless I have that divide and rule. So they keep them dividing, so I can get the diamond from group A, diamond from group B, and diamond from group C, and I'm feeding into the conflict. United States feeding all parties weapons, all of them, and feeding the ideologies. So what we have, and I always say that the cultural advancement and cultural enhancement of nations is the first mega project that leaders will have to think about, because you would argue with me and I argue with you about political ideologies, but if we are cultured and understand and think properly, you and I are wrong.
Yeah, I know we're off topic. We're supposed to be talking about Brexit.
No, it's an important, because part of the exit of England is the pride of the British.
One more question about
economic
Africa.
Power.
A big subject in the news. Is it only symbolic, the announcement of this African Union passport, this Africa passport? Is it just a symbol for what's to come in the future?
Whatever is announced can be done. However, who's actually is the one that moves it? Nobody. If you look at Gaddafi, for example, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago, he spoke about the United States of Africa. Part of it can be done, even on the economic integration, but nobody takes note. He's a mad guy. What are you talking about, in terms of United States of Africa? But now you have United Europe. You've got the NAFTA in North America. You've got Andrea in South America. You've got the Asian in East Asia.
Southeast,
and you've got the SADC in South Africa. Whatever integration people are proposing can be done. It can be done. However, in the end, you're stuck with whoever really is the decision maker. So, and major colonial powers, they just leave them dream about how they want to enhance and develop themselves, but in the end, they are the ones that are going to make a decision.
All right, back to Britain, please. I want to ask you about will pulling out this process, you say legally it'll take 2 years to completely implement. How will Britain, if they will benefit, how will they benefit?
Well, in terms of the benefit, as we said, they benefited in terms of foreign direct investment coming from Europe. They benefit from labor employment. They benefit from movements of cash, movements of technology, movements of political power that basically is fed and supported by economic power. But what are the alternatives for England now? Unfortunately, even during the relationship of Britain within the European Union, they had non-European countries trading very well and strongly with England. England never really relied on European trade. They have a lot of other trade ties, like with the United States, Africa, particularly when it comes to energy. So they're using their trade ties with the Arabs. They're using their trade ties with East Asia. They're using it with the United States in terms of technology. So the damage that will Britain suffer from will be minor in terms of trade, because over 75% of their trade is actually with non-European. So they really, that's why it was driven politically, because what are we here for? Because we are benefited, but there's no really sole way of dealing with the trade, because we are relying on other agreements. So they're not going to cause themselves a lot of
now,
damage.
Does this allow Britain then to take the gloves off, as we say? They can act politically without
yes, they can start preparing, but it doesn't happen, you know, immediately, because it takes time. You've got a lot of organizations. You've got the European Parliament. You've got the central bank. So there is still a lot of arrangements that will have to be sorted out. There is a lot of cash, British cash in Europe and European cash in England. So a lot of these things will have to be sorted out. Labor contracts, laws. So now you have some European laws that in England, and some English laws that were produced or introduced to Europe. They will have to be sorted out. So it will take time, but I think it will set up a time for a rise of, and I think this is the major difference that we'll see in the next 5 to 10 years, the rise of other trade blocs. We've seen now Brazil, a lot of movement around South America, in South America around Brazil. I don't think there will be major changes on the NAFTA, North America, but we will see a lot of changes on the Arab Union, if the Arabs wake up. And then we'll see South America, and we'll see the Asian tigers. And I think it will be totally different to the 7 tigers we've seen before, because they started the whole model wrong in the beginning. They started to see major differences in the lifestyle. So they started producing countries, became very strong economically, and then they totally turned into a luxury lifestyle. So they collapsed. That's why the 7 tigers collapsed. And the Asians have learned the lesson. And I think they're going to move now differently with the leadership of India and China.
You talked a lot about the economic differences that we can expect with Britain after this process is completed. I'd like to ask you about the interim. Yeah. During this process, you said about 2 years. What's going to be different, if anything? And then also politically. Will there be, what kinds of political benefits or freedom does this give in terms of international politics? Yes. Maybe troop deployments or anything like that? Or
I think let's start with the second part. On a political sphere, I don't think it will make any difference to Britain, but it will make a difference in Europe, because Britain really have always acted singly. We've seen that in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
We've seen that in NATO. We've seen that in Libya. We've seen that in Iraq. We've seen that in Syria. We've seen that with negotiations around the situation in Europe with Russia. So England has always played that as they never been a member. But Europeans will have a different approach now that England is no longer going to be part of that, and they're going to have to take that into account in terms of who bails out in terms of economic help or assistance, who's going to stand in terms of political support, because with the European Union really suffering from the Russian approach around the gas or the energy, England is out. So I think this is going to give Russia more power over the European Union. And my expectation is Russia going to contribute to the collapse of the European Union, because the European Union economically is really standing as a shield against the Russian passion for controlling Europe. So I think with the collapse economically, because this is particularly the change in how we look at politics. Economics now drives politics, not the other way around. If you really get people hungry, you can control them politically. So I think with the control of energy resources in Europe, I think the Russian Federation will be able to get their fingers in European Union a lot more, attracting a lot of European countries to follow them, particularly not going back to the Soviet Union, but I think more of informal follow-up. I think, again, what's going to hit Europe is the interference and involvement of China, India, and Russia in the warm waters of the Arab world because of energy. Europe is really getting, further away. So the situation, I think we're gonna see a lot of developments over the next few years. But again, on the Britain side, it's not gonna affect them because they really never acted as they were part of the EU.
Okay. You talked earlier about the Arab League. There's also the GCC.
Yes.
There's the African Union. These bodies, is it possible to give us an update, your opinion, your thoughts about these bodies working towards the next level in the integration?
And unfortunately, all the smaller bodies are driven by major political powers in the world, including United States, Russia, China in certain areas. GCC is more like a first level. A lot of free trade agreements, removing of trade barriers, some sort of support to the political regimes, but it doesn't go up to the EU level. It more focus on the one or two products like the oil and natural gas. But what we're talking about in terms of the Arab Union is a lot broader than that. Here you're talking about politics, you're talking about economic policies internally and economic policies externally. So the Arabs, for example, some of them have no economic relationship with Russia. The rest will have to cut the relationship or stop it. So we're talking on a global, on a bigger scale. In terms of globalization, I think it's existent, but almost not there. Because the poor countries realize that the exploitation of developed countries over the poor countries have become very clear. And since the globalization and the launch of the 1995 World Trade Organization, you start to see the increase of poverty level worldwide. I think it reached now in some countries about 71%. So you're talking about major poverty rates in the world.
I'd
that's
like to,
because of exploitation.
Yeah, I'd like you to, if you would, Professor, to address this. You know, there are all these programs running around in different international organizations to eradicate poverty, for example.
It's not happening because of how economic systems are working in the world. And let's give an example. Just an example, country like Zambia or country A or B have a trade agreement with the United States. What does Zambia have to give to the United States? Not much. But United States has a lot to give Zambia. So Zambia, for example, can have cotton, raw material, or diamond, or agricultural crops. They don't have manufacturing set up. So they have to send these crops to the United States. And the United States will send it back to them in form of produced or ready-made products. Now, that's a difference. For example, if you look at the Egyptian cotton, for example, the best in the world, but you sell the unit for about 2,000 pounds, let's say about $300. But the fact here is, you receive a T-shirt, just one T-shirt, for $500. So the entire unit, which probably about 60 kilograms of cotton, you send it for $300, you receive one T-shirt for $500. So that's how it works. So poor countries get poorer and rich countries get richer. And here we get what we call the aggressive capitalism. And that's why I find the United States always address that issue of capitalism as a serious issue, because that's where the power is. If poor countries stop trading with the United States, they won't have raw materials. They won't have that difference in profit. So, for example, I'm as a country, I will produce my cotton, manufacture my cotton, so that difference in profit will be in my pocket. So it's not going to go to the United States.
So is indebted, first of all, I think I hear you saying that these poverty eradication programs are disingenuous. They're not sincere.
Exactly, because you're going on the opposite direction. We always say that you've got somebody who's got infection and he's warm. If you treat his heat, it helps, but the disease is still there. So you have to actually go back to the bottom, the root of the problem.
Yeah.
So fix the infection, the heat will go away. But if you always focus on treating what is obvious, it's not going to solve the problem. So at this moment, you've got poverty. You're trying to solve poverty, but that's not going to go away. Go back a few steps and see what is causing poverty. Stop that, and it will stop.
And isn't it the case that some of the remedies actually make the situation even worse?
Exactly.
I'd like to hear more about how this makes it worse. We have a short break right now, Professor, and we will come back to continue. Assalamu alaikum and welcome back. We continue in our social segment for the program with the Professor emaad.muhanna. We are looking at the Brexit, this movement for Britain to move out of the European Union, and we are internationalizing our discussion, looking at various examples of the impact of this example in other locations. When we left before the break, Professor, I had asked you about what prevents about the sincerity of these poverty eradication programs. Yep. You said that they are disingenuous. They're not really going to ever alleviate poverty. And my question, my follow-up question is, what stops a government that is impoverished, that needs to develop, from building a factory and producing finished goods? What stops them from doing that?
The world is really, unfortunately, is based at this point on corrupt leaders. And this is really the main reason behind the crisis, economic crisis you see in the world. If you look at what is happening in Africa, for example, and let's give an example because I've seen it, on hand in Zimbabwe. The money that used to be paid by Tony Blair to Zimbabwe to protect the white farmers, to maintain the ownership, when Mugabe was basically accepting that. But suddenly, Tony Blair stopped paying. He had basically some sort of fight with Mugabe, and then the African farmers went out confiscating the land, and the whole country collapsed. So the fact here is, that's a corruption from Mugabe. So the fact here is, you've got a lot of resources in Zimbabwe. Measure on that everything in Africa.
So you're saying
Egypt, for example, was richer than England in 1945. A lot richer.
Egypt.
Egypt gave England money in the Second World War, and amounts now, I think it's over $40 billion, alone for weapons. They never paid that money back.
The turnaround was so quick.
Exactly. But at this point, so the corruption that took place, in the causing that damage.
Previously, you talked about factories being closed down.
Exactly.
Ones producing airplanes, for example.
That's right. Cars.
Cars.
Yeah.
All this stuff shut down.
Heavy industries. The factories. I remember in one of the stories about how Japan developed their trains. In 1946, they came to Egypt to learn how to operate trains. Japanese, because Egypt is the second country that operates trains after England. Japanese in 1946, after the Second World War, came to Egypt to learn how to operate it. Now, it's other way around.
Yeah.
So the fact here is, how did that take place?
You're
corruption.
saying corrupt leaders.
Corruption. Because you've got a lot of resources, and you went away. I took over. Why does it collapse?
Is it also, Professor, I've heard some documentaries about the so-called hitman.
Yeah.
Developed countries send in an individual to meet with the newly elected head of state, saying if you don't play ball our way, we're going to turn your country upside down.
Yeah, but here again, it's part of the under the table deals. That's
to individual leaders.
Exactly. Yeah.
In other words, he pockets a few tens of millions of dollars and stores it offshore.
Yeah. Or he's going wrong, because a lot of them were actually involved in a lot of bad situations, like pornography, or or smuggling weapons, or smuggling money laundry. So they get caught, and this is one of the weapons that the Jews use. They use women. So you get stuck in a
like a blackmail situation,
blackmailing situation, and in the end you sell your entire country for just a one night. So here, and I always say, when we talk about issues like that, people think, don't just take things for granted. Think, why would you have a 200 profit per month, for example, and suddenly you give me the shop to manage it, and it collapses? There must be something wrong.
Right, right.
So this is what we think. Think about the richness that exists in the Arab world. Why are we like this? Africa. Why are we like this?
So much
Africa is full of gold,
yeah,
diamond. Now you find that you and I are digging and excavating diamonds, and you and I are killing each other to send it to England. So this is the fact that culture and education, and that's why I always say that the colonial powers in the beginning used to focus on destroying the army. But later on, they found that's too much. It's costly.
Get individual leaders.
Individual leaders. And through that, they can implement whatever they want. So look at the major powers in the past, and look at what they've done. You find that the 4 areas were implemented through their corrupt leaders inside. The damage of culture, the damage of education, the damage of health, and the damage of the management of the country. In terms of the public administration. So now you find Egypt, for example, is number 14, the most corrupt country in the world.
I'd like, Professor, to ask you also about, we touched on it during the break, indebtedness. This whole process, because once you're in a status of only exporting raw material and you have a permanent trade deficit, you need loans to try and bail out your situation. But the loans make the situation worse.
Make the situation worse for what is it? Because remember now, if I'm, let's say, taking an example with United States. Now I export cotton, and I destroyed my own textile industry because of corruption. Now, because they take the cotton from me as a raw material, so now I want to develop myself, so build factories. When they give me the loans, they dictate how to use it.
They have terms.
They have terms.
And conditions.
And that's why you find, as soon as you get involved with the World Bank or the IMF, you're gone, because they dictate how to use it. Give me one loan that was used to develop education. None. One loan to develop agriculture, roads. It's always about, media, cinema.
Importing more consumer goods.
And also one, if you allow me, one of the reasons also the play on that and the consumption point you raised is one of the consequences that take place because we're not producing. So slowly we become reliant on the imports because we don't produce. So I'll give you an example that took place in most Arab countries. For example, you raise a chicken and it costs you about, let's say, $10 to, you know, feed it and look after it, etc. Until it's becoming a good mate to use, $10. They bring you a ready-made chicken, everything looks fancy, for $5. So culturally destroying your concept of production. Saying, why do I produce it and you know, for $10 if I can buy it for $5? And slowly you say, well, there's no point, it's already cheap in the market. So you get rid of your production, and now you've got no production whatsoever, and then you buy the chicken for $5. Overnight, that $5 chicken becomes $50 chicken. You've got no production. You have to get it. And that's how it's always used when it comes to production. And measure on that everything else. Meat production, food generally, cars. When you close your own car manufacturing countries, now you get $1 million truck. You have to move your goods and services, so you have to buy that $1 million truck. So they exposing you to very wrong ideologies and policies, and in the end, exhausting your finances. So you fall into the debt.
When we look at the situation, there's, you know, external factors, very strong external indebtedness, and all these unfavorable economic terms. Individual leaders who are corruption, and the people around the ground.
Conspiracies as well. Conspiracies, the international conspiracies that takes place, because what controls the energy and the economic sectors in Europe is all about politics. You know, how Russia, you know, overcomes this factor of energy to twist the European arms, because Europeans, some of them are standing with the United States. So Russia want to get into the United States. So how do you do that? So they pressurize European countries that need their gas. So they affect the voting. That's how it works. So you have to understand that, and that's where we get the political economy. They became, you know, two faces to one coin. Politics and economics. We have to always look at it, and it's not as it seems.
And you've told us time and time again, Professor, that wars now are largely economic.
Exactly.
You don't need to send in troops.
No,
the way it was done traditionally.
I always used to say that in the past, I use an army. I want to get the bread that you have. That loaf of bread you have, I'm going to use my army to attack you, beat you, and get the army. Now, I'm going to push you to a situation where you're going to have to beg me to take that bread. That's how it works. Now, we're giving the Europeans, here's our oil, but just come and defend us from Daesh. Here's our oil, come and defend us from terrorism. And they created terrorism. Here's our oil, but just give us weapons. Here's our oil, but just give us technology. Here's our oil, but just come and fix our education system. That's how it works.
So the way out, you said, also, you've given us the prescription time and time, repeatedly.
Culture.
Culture.
Culture number one, educate people, be transparent, educate people. People have to have their loyalty to their nations, not to leaders. Look at any situation in Turkey now. There is some people with Erdogan and some against. Egypt, some with and some against. Everywhere.
Right.
We don't want that. We want people that are with country. Who are you? I'm a Turkish. Who are you? I'm Egyptian.
Forget this.
Forget individuals, because that's where it becomes ideologies. Number one. Number two, fixing the education system. Education system is the least that gets budget for development. Nothing.
You mean both in budget to fund the education, but also the content, removing
The
this
content,
colonial educational system?
That's right. That's right. So correcting basically the 4 factors that I said about how nations are destroyed. Nations are destroyed through 5 factors: culture, education, health, administration system that runs the country, and the army. So these 5 were basically can destroy any country. Our army, we used to be, you know, the first one. We use armies and fight, but now it's the last one. Why do I fight you if I can basically push you to a situation where you fight with your own army? And that's what we've seen in the Arab world. What you see in the Arab world now, that civil war, is basically to break down armies. Why do I fight it? If I can create a conflict between you and army, so you fight your own army.
Is that your commentary on what happened in Turkey last week?
Exactly. That's what's happening. And in the Arab world, now the Iraqi army is gone. Syria, Libya, Egypt was intended. So this is the fact. We have to be, and how do I understand that as a citizen? Culture. Fix up my brain, and we fix up people's brains through culture, transparency, and media plays a major role in how you explain to them.
But now the horse, as we say, is out of the barn.
Yeah.
Everybody wants to be consumers of these Western goods, drinks, and restaurant experiences, and clothes, and all of this stuff, and watching.
Because principles are upside down. Is how
to get the horse back in.
Exactly.
Yeah.
In the past, government schools were the best. Private schools were produced or were established to take bad kids that don't qualify to go to government school, take them to private school.
Now it's opposite.
Now it's opposite. Now private schools provide more education or better education than government school. How does that work? Because the pyramid is upside down. We misunderstand our religion. We misunderstand our culture. So this is the fact that I was talking about. People, the loyalty of people are not to their religion, are not to their, the loyalty is not to the nation, loyalty is to individuals. And that's wrong. So if you can fix up these principles, people will go back to the right track. The track that we all walking on now, it's a wrong way.
Do we have to have the government? To what extent do we have to have the government agree with this?
We have to, because the government step equals 100 of you and I can do. We can do a program like this, and I think Al-Hudda channel, because it's one of the really channels that focus on educating and explaining things to people, explaining about economics and politics and how it works. But the government can take 100 steps of what just we've done.
But we have,
quicker.
One of the books I read in college, I'll never forget, it was called Dark Days in Ghana, written by Kwame Nkrumah, one of the Pan-African fathers who were talking about this United States of Africa. He, in this book, had a table with a list of coups and assassinations that happened by people who had a certain mindset that were systematically eliminated, as he described it.
That's right.
And replaced with people who had been trained in various European countries.
Programmed. That's exactly how you kill the country's culture. So you find, for example, when women are going in the right way about hijab and all the dress code and everything, suddenly you find somebody that comes on TV and say, women, the freedom to women. You know, they've been victimized and all the fancy words. And suddenly you find people are walking with bikinis. So twisting principles is the approach. It's a soft approach. It takes time. But the fact here is you get people more convinced. So, for example, if you ask a person, I want you to convert from Islam to any other religion, he will refuse. But if you getting him maybe pornography or anything else, he will fall into it. So it's softer, takes time, but it's effective. And you get him to drive it. So now I'm marketing to you the fancy watches and the fancy suits and the fancy cars. So now instead of building a mosque or a church or whatever, you're investing in a car. You're investing in a large house. You're investing in all fancy things, but the brain is empty. You never used any part of that money to educate yourself or read or whatever. So the fact here is we have to get people back. And the way we get people back is through the media. Unfortunately, reading has become very difficult. It's very difficult to get people to read because it really goes through the school. It's very time consuming. It's been media. Media is the only way to get people quicker to understand what is going on. And remember, in one of the episodes, I said that the constitution of the Arab League was actually written by Eden, the English prime minister. So we think that the Arabs did the Arab League and the Arab Union. No, it was the British that did it. But I'm going to do it as a British with my own terms before you do it. So I'll do it my way.
Right. I'd like to ask you about, we were talking about Britain leaving the European Union. I'd like for you to talk, to specify. Many times you've been with us, you've talked about this, the vision of a new Middle East.
Yeah.
If and when Britain successfully withdraws from the European Union, what, in terms of this new Middle East, can we expect? Is Egypt going to continue to be a target in terms of turning it into a Libya or Syria? What kinds of things should we expect?
The British people are the best when it comes to economic and trade mindset. They are the best. I lived with them, I worked with them, they are the best, really. So I think the benefits they wanted from European Union never really obtained. So definitely it's a bad trade deal, so I have to get out of it. That's number one. Number two, when it comes to politics, I think the British are always taking the American side in terms of looking at how the Middle East can be divided into that situation. And we've seen that some of the groups in Egypt or in other parts of the Arab world were actually funded by British governments. We've seen that, Hassan al-Banna, for example. So the fact here is the Arab politics are always driven by the British ideologies and the British intentions in there, along with the United States. We've never really seen a lot of problems from other European countries, besides France. But I think the Arab politics at this moment very much influenced by the British-American alliance into how this Arab world should look like. Russia, luckily, over the past few years, coming this way, trying to get into the warm waters because of energy, and also to prevent the American-British control over the Middle East. So in terms of how is this going to develop, we will see a lot of developments in the Arab politics. If the Arabs don't really get their ducks in a row, as we say, and unite themselves, they're going to be divided by part with the Russians and part with the American-British approach. And I don't really separate between Britain and United States. The two hands in one glove. They play the same politics. It's almost the same nation. When it comes to politics.
There was a revolutionary war, but you're saying that...
Yes, but they very much, they drank the same ideologies, so they play it exactly the same way. And I think the elimination of the Red Indians in the United States proves that the British really approach in terms of how they deal with colonial countries was exactly the same. So that was the approach.
Professor, we're down to our last 5 minutes. How would you like to sum up? We started talking about Britain pulling out of the EU, and we were able to relate it to so many different global political, economic contexts.
I think tomorrow's ours as Arabs. This is what we need to realize, because European Union has reached the ultimate level that they could reach. European Union, or European community, is that's the maximum Europeans can do. They cannot get into a political integration. It's never going to happen. There's a lot of ethnic differences, a lot of language and religious differences. It's not going to work. There's a lot of political differences between the East and West in terms of freedom, in terms of a socialism setup versus the democratic and the liberal political systems. Is not going to work. So in terms of how we look at Europe, it's not going to go any further. But it's just going to go backwards.
Okay.
And my expectation economically is going to go down to a free zone, normal market free zone, just exchange goods and services, and that's about it. In terms of United States are very stable when it comes to economic integration because they play it slow with Canada and Mexico, the NAFTA, so we're not going to really see any change in there because they're really not doing anything. I think we'll see a rise on South America with the leadership of Brazil. But you notice now after the Silva start to see a lot of corruption cases in Brazil, a lot of criminal issues, a lot of conflict, political conflict, and now it basically proves that they're not going to leave Brazil alone. They're going to try to break it. The colonial powers, because it's really threatening the economic power of the United States in the South. Because now the South Americans were importing a lot of goods and services from the United States, now they're getting it from Brazil. So here it's going to be an issue. South America is also a good alliance to Russia. So Russia is always there, and it's a theater for conflict. East, I like the East because, as you said before, they're very cultured people. They have an old civilization like Arab civilization, India, China, and others like Malaysia and Singapore. Africa and the Arab world, this is where we're going to see the differences. I think the rise of Africa here is going to go through the liberalization of mind. You have to, you've been undermined for so many years. You've been brought up as an African, as a slave. No, I'm not a slave. I'm going to wake up and I'm going to make a civilization. But how do you get people to do that? Through education and culture is going to take a time. At this moment, you only probably have Egypt and South Africa and some in Morocco that might move the countries in Africa, but the most of them are really down. So they have to get some help. I think the Arabs, that's the time. The launch of the Arab Union, I could see it very clear. It's not going to happen from the current leaders, but I do see or foresee that there's somebody coming to make the Arab Union very strong. It's going to be the largest and the strongest economic power in the world, and we'll see the rise of the Arab Empire economically and politically in the next 5 to 10 years maximum.
All right. Very bright prospects.
Definitely, we believe in it.
Yeah, we're looking for the rise of African states and the Arab powers as well. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you for having me.
This concludes our discussion for tonight and the program for this evening. We will be back on Thursday to continue with more news, information, and discussions. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.